This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. This is episode 12 this year, the Cornell Turf Show, our third season. Glad to have a former guest on, Dr. Roch Gaussoin, University Nebraska-Lincoln. Those of you who have listened or watched the show in the past, Roch's been on chatting golf course turf, and today we got him on the sports episode here, and we're going to chat cultural practices, aerification probably on sports fields. Probably talk about safety a little bit there too. So we're excited for that conversation. But as always, we'll introduce Frank here, and Frank, you can get us going this morning, looking at some weather trends, and as always, a couple little tidbits, good pictures of note. There we go.
Yeah, I mean, you love it, right? Everybody, it's like the pandemic gave us license to bring our little kids and take them around. I think there's going to be a whole burgeoning in 15 years of kids coming to study this stuff because their parents, mothers and fathers, took them to work, right? Nicole at Baltimore, you see her kid raking the field at Camden Yards every once in a while on her Twitter handle. But here's a young man running the Auburn fields, that's a young one there, Roch. That's even younger than your grandchild, which I happen to have a picture of in a minute as well. But I thought, I'd start with what you taught me a long time ago, that N was for knowledge in Nebraska.
Yeah, N is for knowledge. And then when you lay on your side because you've had too much to drink, it makes a Z so nobody disturbs you.
All right. And so thinking of knowledge, Carl, you're the man with the data point for today. What is it?
Yeah, so as a prelude to our conversation with Roch here in a bit, this is a case study we did a couple years ago with one of our undergraduate students, Reese Muller, who was a member of the soccer team in our soccer field, our game field here at Cornell and Berman Field, was pretty compacted on the sidelines, especially where players are kind of warming up during the game, maybe walking around, pacing around. So we did a little case study there. We took Clegg firmness measurements prior to aerifying there, and you can see this blue line for those watching was outside of our preferred range. So a little bit firmer than we'd like, and actually getting close to what we classify as high risk due to excess firmness. Why is that important on the sideline of the field? Because we don't have a whole lot of players running around there. Well, we know from talking to Chase Straw in the past, when athletes are running towards a sideline, maybe trying to save a ball, when they step on a part of the field that's noticeably different, maybe firmer or softer than the other parts of the field, they can't react to that, right? And that's what can cause injuries when they go from a safe firmness level on the playing field to an excessively firm sideline. That becomes a safety issue. So what we did is we went in and did some aerification, 3/4 inch tines, removed those cores, top dressed with some sand. Then a couple of days later, came back and took new measurements. You can see there, this green line reduced our firmness right down into the preferred range. Actually, a better standard deviation, so a more even firmness across that sideline too. So just a good example of when we get firmness readings that indicate maybe we have a safety issue, using some of these cultural practices can really alleviate that, get us back into a safe range.
And in this case, Carl, targeting, right? I mean, the beauty of this thing was it took us a couple of hours all in to do the complete process. And actually, you can see the guy in the background there in this picture actually doing the goal mouths, right, in the penalty boxes. And when money gets tight and you can't do as many things on your fields, focus the resources you have in the places that need it the most. Right. So, Carl, let's get to the weather. And I think, again, this is a common theme we've been having. We call it the roller coaster of the up and down temperatures. And you look at on one day almost approaching a record high, and not 5 days later approaching a record low. And this gets to be really difficult for scheduling things, putting up with where, you're growing a little bit and then you're not growing. So you're obviously getting some heat into the system, but overall it's been cool. For the past week, we've been right around normal, maybe overall 2 degrees above, but lots of areas to the west below normal. And it looks like after some warm-up weather immediately here in the Northeast, we're going back down into the 30s and 40s by Wednesday of next week. So we're going to warm up and then head back down again. And by the time we see each other on the sports show in a couple of weeks, we'll see how much we'll advance, where we are in that roller coaster. So let me move to there we go. And so we start to now, we're starting to accumulate 100 or so growing degree days, or 80 to 100 or so growing degree days since the middle of March, right? So we're about a month in, we've maybe got, 80 to 100. Now, what are we forecasting moving forward? Well, you're seeing still to the south, you're going to do really well. But as you move up north, you're still seeing, teens, 20s, 30s. So not still accumulating very much. And one of the reasons we use these on these kinds of turf, sports turf in particular, is maybe you've got some weed issues you want to deal with. Maybe there's broadleaf weeds surrounding some of the fields. Hopefully it's not on your field. And it's time now, as we use the growing degree day model developed at Purdue, sort of how it fits here, where we think we're getting into the ester form in the metropolitan New York area. We heard from Nick Menchek on the call yesterday, the shortcut call, that dandelions are starting to bloom on Long Island, starting to see a few peak ones here and there near buildings. In northern areas, you start to get them in urban areas where you got more heat island effects, but on Long Island across the board, it looks like they're starting to bloom a little bit. Now, on the rainfall front, everybody's getting rainfall. Everybody's pretty wet. And it looks like we are going to get a little bit more and not dry out significantly. So this is a big part of our discussion today with our guest, Roch Gaussoin, Professor Gaussoin from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And of course, now we bring in soil temperatures. We're still in the 40s, not very high, not very conducive to growth. And this came up a couple of weeks ago with our guest, Ben Polymer, who Roch and I were pals with, the guy I think he stole this quote from, and I think he attributed to him, seed doesn't do you any good in a bag. So it's time to get out and start putting it out there. Ben said that a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's a good reminder. And so many of you, particularly in the springtime, are going to have lacrosse fields, right? This, because of the size of the goal mount, this thing is impossible, right? So you get these kinds of surfaces that it gets hard to grow anything in. And so, Roch, this is the surprise thing for today. Well, you have to give me a little bit to set you up here. But this is something you did, I think, in the late 90s. You did it in Nebraska, in Kansas, and in Iowa, right? Where you said, screw it. Actually, in the narrative, I think you say sports field managers are so desperate to have any cover, they don't care what it is. Just give us some grass cover. So you did this, I just showed you one table here, and draw your attention to what you did, right? This was incorporating Bermuda grass, seeded Bermuda grass, its own rarity. And you can see the various types of seeded Bermuda that were available. You did them alone and with some perennial ryegrass. But what I thought was really interesting, when you looked at just overseeding with perennial ryegrass, right? You got to 90% cover, right? And 37% exposed soil, by far the highest exposed soil amount there, right? So what do you think about this now, 20 years in, climate change? I got Bermuda grass, I'm fighting in Brooklyn. At what point does this become a viable thing, not just a whim you guys put together to do this? Have you followed up on any of this? Let's start with this conversation.
So that's a great question. And, we still have some on very high abused fields. I don't even call them high use anymore, because they, especially our intramural fields and things like that. And then, and as well as some of these smaller, your rural communities where they don't really have a budget and they're spending money on ryegrass, but our data shows the ryegrass is pretty well gone at the end of the season anyway. But we actually were able to develop a little bit of thatch with a little bit higher nitrogen, not excessive nitrogen, using Bermuda as the overseed. I'm not going to say the appearance is spectacular, because of course it goes dormant. Although the first year seeding in Bermuda grass stays green a little bit longer. That may be a density thing, environmental. We're not really sure why.
So when did you seed these? In the fall, right?
Yeah, we would see them in the fall, or actually late summer before we had spring sports on whatever it was on the like soccer and intramural complex. You certainly wouldn't see them any other time because so we'd see them in summer. Those fields might be getting used a little bit. And if they were getting used a little bit, we might use a little bit of rye because Bermuda takes a little longer to take hold. And then you throw in the climate change. I mean, clearly the climate was changing back then. I mean, climate is always changing, but
Right.
but it wasn't on the trends. It was on the trends that we're on now, and we weren't predicting anything. I'm not that visionary. I'm not Frank Rossi, right? So so I wasn't that visionary, but now I see Bermuda creeping further and further north. And I wish it would be Kachon more than Zoysia. I know Zoysia's, they're growing it in Indiana and other locations. I just don't think the recovery and the growth potential of Zoysia is anywhere near, even with the new ones, anywhere near Bermuda grass. And seed is relatively cheap, and I use relatively.
It used to be cheap.
But all seed is expensive now. I saw ryegrass go from $1.20 a little over a year ago to $3.30, $3.40 now, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But I understand shortages and it's supply chain and everything else, right?
Well, and it's ridiculous when you think about the places that continue to overseed warm season grasses, the ryegrass seed rates that they use. That they got away with $1 a pound, that they're not going to get away with at $5 a pound. So listen, let me move on, because the real topic of conversation here was about soil stuff, right? I want to talk to you about early soil stuff. We talked with Doug last week for lawns and grounds, and sort of really analyzed the need for routine widespread aerification. And now the caveat, as I set up for you in our weather, is we got wet soil conditions. And when you go to our Safe Sports Fields website, we have this statement in there that says, not when it's too wet, it's a Goldilocks, right? Not too wet, not too dry. Here's, maybe a couple of days after normal rainfall on a moderately well-drained soil, you try to caveat as best as you can. So what I want to go through in setting up our conversation is, one, here's how we tell people about it. This is our Safe Sports Field website that we encourage everybody to make their way to. And we've talked about this in the past, that cultivation is generally short-lived. High traffic areas may need as much as 6 to 8 cultivations a year. So that is obviously something to consider in goal mounds and other, high traffic areas on soccer fields, right? This is the traditional approach that we think about, getting out there and core aerifying. The thing that I think is funny is that's a good looking turf. What the hell are they aerifying that thing for? I'm starting to ask myself these questions I didn't ask myself in the past, Roch. But when things get limited, I'm like, well, what the hell? Maybe you're overseeding, but Jesus, is there any place for the seed to go in here? So we start to think about, okay, what are the various ways to approach this? And I know you and I have chatted about this. You've done some resources on this. I'm going to show you the one that we have on our website. But here's a airway, right? A knife that goes in, does some shattering. These things wear out. You start to wonder about the value of this device. You start to look at the shattering versus the cores, and you see maybe you're impacting a little bit more surface area than you are when you're separating it by 4 or 5 inches on a field. Obviously, there's a question about in one pass, how much good do you do? So I particularly wanted to indict this spoon aerification equipment, Roch. And I wanted to use our pal, Chase Straw. He did some work with Gerald Henry when he was a grad student there. Becky Grubbs, who's at Texas now, their colleagues at Texas, Bob Caro and Van Klein. So this was obviously done a little while ago, but it was reported in 2013, right? So a lot of people, first off, in their core ideas, half the sports turf managers are using this open spoon thing because you go fast. And they were like, well, is it any good, right? Is it any good to use this open spoon? So here's a big data table, and the podcast people are saved not having to look at this thing. But they measured things like surface hardness, penetration resistance, volumetric water, NDVI, which is turf cover, and all these measurements. And only 1 year was there any effect on surface hardness. No other variable in any of the 3 years, no matter how many times you did it, was impacted by open spoon aerification. And they did it up to 4 times a year. So I went into the results here, and there's this really interesting text there where they say, well, our research says you may need to do this more than 4 times a year, because we didn't start seeing a benefit from this particular type of aerification unless you did it 4 times. But then you get yourself into the compaction layer, right? You're doing it a lot of times the same way. Ricky showed this back in the day, Roch, even before you went to Michigan State. He started looking at these compaction pans when we got these new devices, right? So along come these new ways of doing things. And we, like Air 2G, but we go back to something that we put on our website. I know you've got a similar resource. This is cultivation practices and their goals during playing seasons, right? What are you trying to do? So we're in the season now. Obviously, you can't do drill and fill, and it says you can't slice things. Small slicing and spiking, that might help with water infiltration. So what I want to do and chat with you about, and I got a couple of questions I'm going to get to here. Here's the between seasons. If you don't have a spring sports season, you have some more options available. I thought I'd bring up the grandpa picture, the proud grandma and grandpa picture, which is always a good way to introduce you, and ask you a couple of just simple questions to get us started here. How do you know what you need to do for aerification? And how do you balance, what you're using with the tactics, you can employ, right? How much the field gets used, where it gets used, and how you want to attack it. So let's start with how do you know what you need, especially when your soil's really wet here, like it is in the Northeast right now? What do you think?
So both great questions. And how do you know what you need? And this isn't a non-answer, but it is a way of looking at, there's an art and a science to what we do, right? And this is where the art comes in, because conditions are different from location to location. And, you can have a rainfall, at least in our region, you can have a rainfall and then literally 10 miles away, they get no rain. So certainly when we make these blanket recommendations, like, we think we can prescription this, and we can to a limited extent. And then what's the end game? And I think Minner, clearly Minner was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And he was always looking at, well, what's your goal? What do you want it to do? Are you trying to put seed down and not really alleviate compaction? And that chart, we use that same chart when we do this training, right? That chart kind of shows that what's your goal? I mean, do you want to get seed in the ground? Do you want to shatter during, and they make a generic recommendation there, but at the same time, they're not saying that this is the absolute way you have to do it, right? So where do you start is what do you want to do? And sometimes if the soil is wet and you go in there with any cultivation device, it's going to make it worse. But if you need to get seed in the ground, certainly seed resting on the top of muddy and compacted soil. So then I would go with I would probably consider short-term, even though the long-term benefits are good, a slicer or something like that, where a very superficial slicer, or maybe even something that dimples a little bit, knowing you're going to increase the compaction, but the less or the smaller area of that tine and the less invasive it is, then you're going to compact higher up, and which is going to get torn up by players anyway, right? So in that scenario with wetter soils, let's go shallow, create a seed bed, get the seed down, whether it's, we were talking about Bermuda before, whether it's Bermuda or rye, because certainly those are the grasses of choice in these scenarios where we need cover quickly. So just don't be as aggressive, realizing that this is a Band-Aid at best until you can get in off season, or an away stand or whatever, however their practices are, or however their scheduling goes, right? And if it's a really ultra high use field, the scenario is they're putting seed out as often as they're doing any kind of cultivation, right? Or maybe more so.
Yeah. So what about the open spoon? Did you like my indictment? Because a lot of people use this thing, and maybe that's just a limited study. And they even said the caveat, there might be short-term benefits, but this was a 3-year study looks like doing it 4 times a year would be enough. What are your thoughts when you get out there talking to native soil fields and you know they're doing this open spoon stuff?
Well, when I saw that article, I was questioning. Of course, I think we all were, right?
Sure.
50% of the people doing it. And so then I did a straw poll in our region, and it was about 50%. So I think that data is pretty valid. And that's a piece of equipment that is quick. They're relatively inexpensive. They're relatively easy to maintain. There's a lot of good about that.
100%.
But then, so I was, you called it an indictment. Then I started thinking about how long-term core aerification is, or how long-term any of our cultivation technique. And I kind of went, it's short-term, but it still has value. I wouldn't use it on a wet soil. I mean,
Right.
Right. I mean, I thought we've already kind of covered that, but
Right.
I actually don't see that as a negative. I'm not comfortable with the idea that if 4 didn't work, then 6 might. I wonder what direction you're going to go. We don't really know that, right? We just, but it was 3 years worth of data. But if, they stuck to their guns and they did the same study year after year after year, and they tracked it really, really well, it was amazing to me how many things weren't better than the control.
I know. Well, this, brings me to the point here. When I show you this picture of really good looking turf, and you see people taking 6-inch hollow tines out of a decent soil that drains well and's got good turf cover, why do we do that?
Well, I call that the farmer mentality. I got a tractor, I should use it, right? And I'm going to go cultivate. And we know cultivation, in farm fields kills microbes and, oxidizes microbes and all that other stuff, right? And I'm like, so we're doing this and we may not need it. When you like that picture you showed, there's an example. What's wrong with that turf and why are you punching a hole in it?
So here's what I get. I'll give you what I get. Well, if I don't do it, it won't look like that. The minute I stop doing it, it's going to fail and I won't be able to sleep.
Well, if we'll go back to what you showed at the very beginning that Carl talked about, I've always thought about a field. I don't care what it is. It can be field hockey. We don't play that here, but, or lacrosse. We don't play that here either. But, it could be, American football or the real football, right? And we know the wear areas. We know the maintenance areas that need the most help. So when I show a picture of a field, I often say, think about it like a golf course. We manage our greens differently than we manage our tees, than we manage our fairways, and we manage our rough, right? And in any park system, you're going to have areas that are kind of like rough and areas that are, and just using a golf analogy. So why not manage these areas? And I really like what you showed there, because it's like, here's where, you've got that transition for player safety. So that's a great catch, right? And the reality of it is that they're running on this field that you've really maintained well, and then they hit basically concrete. And, that can't be good for an athlete's feet or everything else, even a weekend warrior type athlete. So treat those areas differently, and not even, I'd go so far as to say, Frank, you said when budgets are tight, you can always spend money on something else. So let's do that routinely. So maybe you go into those areas, 4 to 6 times a year, but do you really need to, let's get outside the hashes in American football, right? Let's get outside the goal mouse and the center, line for soccer. Let's always do the sidelines if they haven't unfortunately put in. I love the word places where they put artificial turf in, right? and then they put it on the sidelines. And I'm like, okay, you've got a temperature gradient, you've got a transition in surface, and maybe it's not wearing out, but that's not good for anyone's health and well-being when it comes.
No, that's for sure. Hey, Carl, did I see a comment
from Ben? Yeah. Ben's got a great question. I was actually thinking about this too. So Ben's comment is, we feel like gas exchange, and we read this in textbooks, is important, but difficult to measure. And I think to your point earlier, Roch, you were talking about it's an art and it's a science. I'm thinking the same thing Ben is. How could we measure something like that? Is there a test to measure gas exchange? And is that something we could foreseeably use to drive, okay, if I need more gas exchange, here's what I'm going to do?
You mean as a diagnostic tool?
As a diagnostic
tool, we can do it with lab experiments and, platinum electrodes, and there's a lot
Well,
of
we can do it with bulk density. Can't we just assume that there's less air when there's more bulk density, when the bulk density is higher?
Yeah, I mean, we could do soil physical measurement, but that's not I was thinking more along, if I was understanding Carl's question, what can we do to say, yeah, we need to do this now, exactly, rather than taking a bulk density measurement and then waiting, to have it, imagine you could set up a lab if you wanted to in your shop or whatever and measure bulk density.
So you're saying everybody needs a platinum electrode right next to their Clegg hammer?
No, I'm saying, no, they don't need that, because I'm not sure number one, I just know that all the work that Jim Murphy did when we were colleagues at Michigan State, he was a master's student. I was working on my PhD. He, those platinum electrodes were a pain. I mean, they bend, they do this. And, if the electrode isn't connected, you get false readings, or you don't get a reading at all, or you get some sort of weird little background. The noise on them, I felt, was pretty high. And
So
I want a quick solution.
Not easy to measure gas exchange or
oxygen diffusion, which is, essentially an indirect measure of gas exchange.
But see, here's the thing I keep going back to, and I'm glad Ben's here because he probably saw the conversation with Machete or watched the video because he wasn't able to do it live. How is the soil behaving? I don't care about gas exchange. Is it sustaining turf? And if it's not sustaining turf, does it, is it easy after a rainfall to see if water infiltrates, right? I mean, there's some diagnostics you can do. I think the tougher issue is deciding, okay, it's not draining well, it's in the season, it's starting to thin, maybe I'll make a hole, but let me throw something in, Roch. Should I top dress? Would you put some sand? Would you put some compost? Would you do any soil amending as you were thinking about improving that soil in situ in the season?
Okay, so let's start with sand, right? And if you start sand top dressing, you can't quit.
Okay.
All right, you're going to be sand top dressing forever. And you were going to use bulk density as your diagnostic. You put sand on, your bulk density immediately goes up.
Okay.
Okay, so all of a sudden we get rid of a diagnostic, right? I mean, if that's the one you want to use,
right.
And once I can't stress it enough. We've got an example in golf, with push-up greens where they started top dressing and people said, well, we can't do this anymore, or we're going to delay it or whatever, and then they start getting layering, and that creates a problem. And when you look at those greens that have been top dressed for 40 years. 30 years at least, right? They perform relatively well, but you've created a new root zone, right? And you've done it over time. Certainly top dressing has value in creating a surface that doesn't compact as much. And, in a perfect world, all sports fields would be flexible enough to have a sand-based, but they don't.
Well, and then, there's the old MSU Spartan sport. What is that thing Trey created? The Spartan system? With the grid.
Copy? Yeah.
That's so great.
Well, it actually started at Rutgers, Harry Endo.
I don't care where it started. I think it's so great people name it, like the Penn guys. They got to name everything Penn something.
Yeah, and if you say Penn Cross, you're wrong. You're right. But if you say A4, you're wrong because it's Penn A4.
Okay, so it sounds like big no. Okay, if you're going to get involved in starting to sand top dress as a soil amendment tactic, your opinion is you better think long and hard. What about, have you seen, again, not in season, but maybe remedial, have you seen the sand slits, those big pieces of equipment that inject the sand a few inches down on like 4 or 5 inch centers? It's a big hopper. I think it's I don't know if it's a blade or it's one of those, you know what I'm talking about. It's a big hopper of sand, big slits. Is that a good interim thing in a goal mouth?
See, I think where you have issues where, especially goal mouths tend to get depressed, and then they become water catchment, right? And so if you had extra sand in there, certainly that would help with some drainage of some kind. Even just a hole. I remember I took care of some sports fields when I was a graduate student at New Mexico State. It was my first consulting job, right? And they had some it was flood irrigated. So I'll give you an example of how low tech it was, right? You opened up a valve and stood there and watched the water. And when you had 4 inches on the surface, you closed it down and walked away, right? But we went in and cored large cores, backfilled them, kind of made like a USGA spec green in that coring hole. I mean, we're talking 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and those low areas then drained really well. And then we just capped them with the Bermuda grass that we had cut off when we dug the hole, right? And it seemed to work relatively well. And it kept water away from, this is a soccer complex, from the goal mouths, and there were some lower areas on the field because you can imagine it wasn't leveled at 100%. Even though it was flood irrigated, it still wasn't as level as it should be, because you put 3 to 4 inches on. And they irrigate them, like every 2 weeks.
It's the whole idea of flooding a field to irrigate it is something that's hard for most people back east to contemplate. So listen, we're at the witching hour here. So Carl, are there other questions before we start to wrap it up?
I got nothing left on my end.
All right, one more then. Compost.
See, I don't think there's enough information. Certainly we believe compost to be a positive for soil health, if we're going to use that term, and it does, it holds water, but it also helps break up, increase aggregation, et cetera.
Yeah,
all of the positives that we know.
It's physical property amendments for sure.
But I don't know how we get it an appreciable amount into the profile. And I just don't think there's enough. There might be data out there that I'm not aware of. So I'm not going to say that it's not out there, but I really don't see the data on what that does. And there's way more data on crumb rubber, right? I mean, we haven't really looked into organic matter in incorporation, especially with, we've got all these yard waste locations, we've got availability, it does have a cost associated with it, but it's certainly not something that you have to commit to. You wouldn't have to top dress compost every 7 to 14 days once you committed to it, like you would with sand. So I don't know, but I think there would be a positive effect. And I do know of some sports turf managers that are putting compost down prior to using not a solid tine, traditional solid tine, but something that will push it down into the profile. Off season, when it's dry enough that they actually get some shattering at the same time, which helps incorporate that organic. And they seem to think that it's a pretty positive practice. They said the turf looks greener. I'm sure that's a nitrogen effect, but at least we're seeing that the nitrogen, the nitrification is happening, and that's a soil health thing, right? So so I'm not going to make a commitment to compost, but I see that there's value. There's a potential value in there that we don't know yet.
Well, at your age, you got to watch how many commitments you make, Grandpa. So anyway, thanks for joining us, Roch. It's always good to hear you and see you, at least your outline. But I'm sure.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to everybody, but I'm in a different spot. And it's sunny here. It's been cloudy for 4 days, and of course today it's sunny here. But
right,
I always appreciate it and hope to do it again soon.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.